Hello and welcome back to Highway to Hoover, a production of SEC Extra over at D1Baseball.com. I'm your host, Joe Healy, joined as always by my good friend and co-host, Mark Etheridge. We are here to recap an absolutely jam-packed week 3 around the SEC. It's the best non-conference weekend of the non-conference slate, if you will. Yep. We knew this was going to happen. It happened. Plenty of results to talk about. So we're going to have a really busy show tonight. But before we get into any of that, I have to say thank you to our friends at Academy Sports and Outdoors for sponsoring this and every episode of Highway to Hoover this season. Get ready for a new season of fishing fun with Academy Sports and Outdoors and reel in the best gear at low prices every day. Plus, Academy offers easy ways to shop and save time like free 1-hour in-store or curbside pickup on academy.com orders. As I said at the top, Mark, busy weekend. You and I both were kind of mostly, we both went to Friday games, non-SEC games, and then spent Saturday and Sunday just kind of taking it all in, because if there was one week in a non-conference where that was the move, as the kids would say, it was definitely this one.
Yeah, absolutely. And it lived up to it. There were a lot of good finishes, a lot of good comebacks. And this was the weekend that the SEC, or some of the SEC, challenged itself. Okay. So I wrote this in the dish this morning, and we'll have a follow-up for Monday, is that the SEC lost 4 games on Saturday, and that's probably the most non-conference they would lose all year in a single day, unless it happened today, which is Sunday, and they lost 5, and Texas A&M still playing and leading. But, it's the schedules haven't been that challenging, and the SEC is really good. So you put those two things together, and there's not a lot of opportunity for losses. I mean, not other than just the Omaha upsets like happened to LSU. So I do feel like that most of the teams in the SEC have held serve and won the games they're supposed to win. There's been a few, the Holy Cross, the Omaha, the Cal Poly, there's been a few through the course of it, but for the most part, the SEC teams have played really well in the games they're supposed to win. So the cool thing is this weekend they got to play some more toss-up games, some series that you're not expected to sweep, like with Florida. Auburn was not expected to go in and sweep, and they did. Certainly in the Houston series, only Tennessee swept, and we were wondering what was going to happen out there. So lots to talk about, lots of good competition that is more conference-like, and that will allow us to kind of gauge where teams are, as we head into. We'll start conference play in 2 weeks, so it's almost here.
Yeah, we got the tune-up week next weekend, where for the most part it's softer competition.
It's like the football version of SoCon Saturday.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Exactly. So next weekend a little bit lighter, but this weekend, it was like waves lapping upon our shores, just over and over again. Big games everywhere. Let's start in Houston because, there were 3 SEC teams out there, so that makes some sense. But you mentioned Tennessee going 3-0, two pretty comprehensive wins over Oklahoma State and Arizona. I thought the Rice win obviously also comprehensive, but I don't think anybody really expected that was going to be a competitive game. But the 2 against Oklahoma State and Arizona, they just kind of controlled the game from start to finish. I mean, they didn't put 15 runs on them or anything like that, but just controlled the game and ended up going 3-0. I think there's a couple of headline things here. One is, Gavin Keelan, welcome to stardom, perhaps. He was a nice player at Louisville the last couple of years. I don't want to underestimate what he was the last couple of years, because he was very good, but he's hitting for power more so than he ever did at Louisville. He's not striking out like he did at Louisville. He's walking a ton more than he did at Louisville. All of that's super positive. And then I don't know that Tennessee necessarily expected this freshman group of Clark and Marin and Abernathy to have this kind of impact right away. I think they thought those guys were super talented, obviously, but I think there were enough veteran presence guys back that they thought, these guys may just have to kind of wait a little bit, but they've forced their way into it. And so it's a good problem to have for Tennessee, but man, got a crowded situation, and that's where, my kind of takeaway from this weekend, at the risk of being a little prisoner of the moment, it's just that, I think you take this Tennessee team and maybe LSU, and we'll talk about them shortly. And, I'm starting to increasingly, especially with A&M taking some lumps this weekend, starting to wonder if maybe Tennessee and LSU maybe aren't the two best teams in the country in some order. But that's how impressed I came away from the weekend with Tennessee, is that they feel like a really complete roster with being able to win games all different kinds of ways.
Yeah. I mean, I'll step out there. I mean, Tennessee looks like the best team in the country right now. And I say that because they had so much lost production. And for them to be able to assemble the talent and then, I guess, get the existing players to continue their development so that they've elevated, that they're at a point now, they're nowhere near what they're going to be in May. And look what they're already doing. I'm so bullish. And, AJ Russell is going to continue to come back, right? And where he's not even part of the picture anymore. And Tegan Kuhn's, through today, and he's just kind of ramping back up. I mean, this is not the team we're going to see down the stretch. They're still in, elevate mode. So, and look at what they're doing already. From an offensive standpoint, from a pitching standpoint, they've got so many options, both in the lineup and on the pitching staff. It's a scary team to have to prepare for. And right now they're playing as well as anyone, and they're just figuring stuff out right now. So that's the part that's so enticing about, you want to buy on them. I know their stock's really high, but I think it's going to continue to go up with all the pieces they have once they figure out, where to put everyone. I do feel like, looking around in Houston, Mississippi State, they played 4 teams that we feel like are really, really quality clubs, and they've lost all 4 games. And that's troubling. And they've got another one coming up with Southern Miss in the return trip. The second game was, and that's at home Tuesday night. Hopefully they get that in. The weather didn't look great, but if they really need to beat a good team just to get that monkey off their back, right? Mississippi State has players, and I think right now they're going through this process, kind of like what we talked about with Tennessee. They're just not having success with it. They lost a ton of production. They've got a lot of talented players, and they're trying to get those puzzle pieces in the right spots. And you'd like to do that while you win, and they're able to do it against the subpar competition. But when competition steps up, they haven't had that same success. And you'd like to at least split those games, right? And they have not been able to do that. And Hunter Hines, was supposed to be one of the best returning power hitters in the conference, if not the country. And, he's benched the first 2 games of the weekend just because he's not producing, and he's too good a player for that. You expect him to figure that out. So it's just it's an interesting team to follow, and it's one that can beat anyone on a given day. And it's just a question of how soon is it going to click for them, and how big a hole are they going to dig, right, while this is going on. The good news is, unlike last year, because people are going to try to draw parallels, right, when they lost to Air Force and Austin Peay and those kind of games, these losses, although they hurt you because they're losses, they're to good teams. So you're not going to get that RPI punch that you got a year ago. I feel like Mississippi State, you want to win some of these games, but it's not like you're losing to the 200 plus RPI teams. Okay. So you just need to steady the course. Don't panic. I know people are upset, but I feel like there's enough talented pieces, especially on the mound, right? That they didn't pitch well this weekend, but they've got so many pieces. They just got to get the guys in to fit in the right spots.
Yeah, I think on that, I think there still some maybe things to be settled in the rotation behind Pico Khan. I mean, He's been so good. He did finally walk a guy over the weekend, so he should be benched immediately. That guy can't pitch anymore. But he's, in all seriousness, he's been so good. But, Ligon and Stone Simmons behind him feel a little more combustible. And I think we saw that this weekend.
Mm-hmm.
So the good news from that perspective is their bullpen has looked so good and is so deep that two things are true. One is that chances are, if you want to build a traditional rotation and you don't think Ligon or Simmons are the guy, you could slot in any number of guys.
Yeah.
The second thing is it also takes pressure off those second and third starters because you could just do bullpen games. Now, that's a stressful way to live. Anybody who's ever had bullpen games, a couple times a weekend knows that that's not ideal, but they do have the bullpen talent to do that. But that's, to me, what I looked at this weekend of, like, watching the game against Oklahoma State today, Sunday, as we record, just when it started going sideways on Stone Simmons, it went sideways pretty quick. And that's Oklahoma State. Like, they're a physical team with good hitters. I get that, but you're going to see that every weekend in the SEC for the most part, like that, So it felt like when, like we said, when things went sideways, it didn't take long before it was almost too late.
You wonder if Jacob Pruitt, the Indiana State transfer, is a piece to this. He was really good in midweek against a good Troy lineup. I would assume he would get the ball again Tuesday, assume weather permitting. They play against Southern Miss, and if that goes well, then by SEC play, maybe he's taking one of those spots, because I think they've got Queens the next week. They should be able to pitch you or I in that one and have some success. So I feel like it's, now is the time to kind of tinker and do some experimentation, because of how this weekend, after Pico, it didn't go the way they wanted. I guess the other team in Houston that, when you talk about A&M, buddy, they lost 4 in a row. Looks like they're, as we tape this, they're leading Rice 12-3 in the 6th. Looks like they're on their way to a run rule, perhaps, and they desperately need that. But they just didn't hit. And this was supposed to be the best lineup in the sport. And the stars aren't hitting. The other guys aren't hitting. I mean, Hensler hit, but there hasn't been a whole lot else. And I do feel like they're just too talented for this to continue. What I really thought was going to happen, Joe? I thought that with all the pressure in College Station, when they got away from home and went to Houston, that they would flourish this weekend and play well. And, just kind of, people are doubting us. Let's go out, get away from the home crowd noise. Maybe Houston's too close. I don't know. But that didn't happen, at least not until Sunday. So it's going to be fascinating just to see where this team goes, because they're uber talented. Even with the injuries, they're still one of the most talented teams in the country. Great pitching. The lineup has versatility. You've got depth. You've got everything you need to win a championship. But right now it's up here, and they've just got to find that mojo, man. It's they're too talented to be, getting, what was it, 5 hits on Saturday, maybe it was 4 on Friday. I mean, it's just not enough, and not walking, right? Because you got all those big sluggers that people are afraid to pitch to. So it's really a fascinating problem that they find themselves in. And you think, baseball's a game of averages. If you've got all these good players and they're not hitting, they're eventually going to break out and excel. So we'll see, right? Because we'll see if this happens, because one more weekend before SEC play starts, and then there are no let-ups for 10 weeks. So they need they got to figure it out, and they got to step on it and accelerate to do so.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to compare the weekend for A&M with the weekend for Mississippi State, because ultimately they're both going to get a win over Rice, barring a truly shocking collapse by A&M in the next hour or so. We might need to record an emergency podcast if they lose that one after leading the way they are. So they're both going to go 1-2, having beaten Rice. But for me, the difference is, Mississippi State lost by 1 run to Arizona and had opportunities late. And then today against Oklahoma State, they
Got
got
to come back. Yeah.
don't love that, but they got within 2 runs.
Yeah.
They clearly are fighting, playing hard. And okay, yes, Hunter Hines isn't hitting, but Reed Stallman is hitting, and Noah Sullivan is hitting, and Ace Reese is hitting, and Garrick Fry is a role player who's hitting. And so they've got all these new guys who have kind of injected a little bit of new blood in the lineup, and they've lost 4 games by, I don't know, like what, a combined 6 or 7 runs.
Right. All to good teams, right?
All to good teams, right? But for A&M, it's like yesterday against Oklahoma State, you just kept waiting for like anything to happen offensively, and it just never did. And so I try to steer clear largely of the amateur psychology part of things, because you and I are not in the dugout, we're not in the clubhouse, we're not on the team bus, but it gives the traits of just kind of a listless, uninterested performance. I don't doubt that, I'm not saying they're not out there giving their best, because I know they are, but the body language hasn't been great. It feels like they don't have any fight in them once they get punched in the mouth. And so you compare that to the 1-2 record of Mississippi State, and it doesn't really, even though it's the same record, it doesn't feel the same. I don't think, and if they're the number 1 team in the country too, right? So like the expectation is obviously a factor here. But no matter which way you slice it, just not a great weekend for A&M.
One of the things that is you're talking about A&M that kind of popped in my head is you just wonder, there's been so much talk about this is the year that A&M wins the title. Okay. And that is in late June, and we're in February and now March. There's a lot of stuff that's got to happen between here and there. And you can't fast forward to it. You have to be in the moment, and you have to play the games that are in front of you now. And you can't beat Tennessee when you're playing Cal Poly, right, or Texas State. So I do feel like that there's something to that from a mental aspect of being able to focus on the task at hand. And maybe, through this 4-game losing streak, it got their attention. I mean, that would get my attention. If I go from number 1 in the country to getting to people poking fun at you and, hey, what's wrong with A&M and why do you guys suck? Well, you don't really suck. You're just not playing right well in the moment. But as a 20-year-old, where's your head at? And I do feel like this is where leadership has to play a part, both on the team and from the coaching staff. They've got to make sure that people are focused on the right things, and certainly the talent is as good as anyone out there. So you feel like by April or May, this is going to be a really quality team with a decent resume. But how big a hole are they going to build before they get there? And that's the $1 million question right now. How long is it going to take before A&M is what we expected A&M to be, assuming they get there?
Yeah. Sometimes it's easy to you mentioned the leadership piece, and sometimes it's easy to underestimate how important that can be year to year. I just think of the last few A&M teams that had, Austin Boast and Ryan Targach, and I think to a certain degree, Evan Oschenbeck in the bullpen, that maybe some of those guys weren't the most vocal guys, but they kind of just led by example. And, clearly Evan Oschenbeck, a great story of a guy who just worked his way into being arguably the best reliever in the country, even though he, was flipping in 90-mile-an-hour fastballs, and do they have those guys now? The answer might be yes, but they're going to have to emerge. And it's just those veteran pieces that aren't the super talented guys. Not that you can't be a leader when you're super talented, but those guys outside of the superstars there, where are those leaders coming from? And maybe that's yet to happen and yet to emerge. And if you're A&M, all you need to do is look at a team like Florida last year. They won 36 games overall. And were a couple wins away from that, from a national title theoretically, right? They were in the Final Four of the College World Series in a season in which they had to win games last weekend of the season just to get in to a regional. So in the SEC, you are granted a lot of opportunity, and that's what they have to look at now is, okay, this weekend sucked. It's not been a fun last 10 days, but It doesn't fundamentally. They're not going to have a number one by their name anymore.
Right.
It doesn't fundamentally change anything about their upside, I would say. That's kind of what they'll have to approach it as. All right, let's move on. We're going to talk LSU, then we're going to talk Auburn and go from there. But before we do that, let me give you another ad read from another partner of here at the Highway Hoover podcast, Tecovas Boots. If you love our game, you know that smell, the one that brings you right back. Fresh cut grass, a broken-in glove made with real leather. That's exactly what you get with Tecovas Boots. They're made for baseball people, whether you've been wearing boots your whole life or you're picking up your first pair. With over 200 steps of craftsmanship, they're built to last, feel great right out of the box, and look even better. Anywhere worth going is worth going in good boots. Find your pair at Tecovas. Thank you again to the folks at Tecovas Boots for sponsoring along with Academy Sports and Outdoors. Enjoy having them both on the show. All right, Mark, let's talk LSU. They went out to Frisco, got wins over Kansas State, Nebraska, and Sam Houston.
Yep.
2 hard-fought wins. Kansas State took them to 10 innings. That was a fun game. They shook off Nebraska late. That was a close game. They fell behind a little bit, but got it together and then kind of shook off Nebraska late. Today, the Sunday game got kind of wonky on them. Like Sam Houston fought back a little bit, but that game, I think it finished 12-8 or something like that. It was not really that close, to be honest. But long story short, a 3-0 record. And I talked about with Tennessee how, I'm with you in that it's hard not to look at Tennessee and think that, hey, this might be the best team in the country again. But LSU's right in that conversation for me. Yeah. And I think largely what has impressed me with them is that, like, their young guys are ready. Derek Curiel in the lineup stands out, but then the pitchers, to me, like the young pitchers have really given that staff a lot of depth, at least on paper, with the way they've shown, so far. Kason Evans and William Schmidt, in particular, have really been impressive. And so for me, it's like, and Tennessee has the same thing going, right? Because we talked about Levi Clark and Marin and Abernathy. Like, when you have that combination of, in LSU's case, we know what to expect from Jared Jones. Like, Josh Pearson just won MVP of the Frisco Classic. Like, is he kind of a guy who's taken a big step? And then you combine that with, oh, by the way, here's this group of freshmen who are ready to be guys right away. That's kind of the secret sauce, I feel like, with the teams that are really, really national title contenders at the top of the sport. And I think LSU is right there. We could sit here and nitpick the weekend a little bit. Oh, Chase Shores wasn't as good as they'd like him to be, and they let Sam Houston hang around, yada, yada. But for the most part, like, they took care of business this weekend, and I think there's something to be gained from the fact that the first 2 games of the weekend in particular didn't come easy necessarily.
Yeah. Well, this was their pre-conference week, right? Because the rest of the schedule hasn't been that challenging. Remember they went to Arlington and played DBU on Wednesday. So they went to Texas and won 4 games against, 4 pretty good opponents. And I feel like that was what they needed to do. They needed to be challenged, and they were able to take some punches and then respond. The thing that stands out about LSU, and I would say this about a couple of the other, maybe several of the other SEC contenders, Tennessee, Florida, Georgia, they have multiple pieces in the lineup. They've really got 12 to 13 guys that they can mix and match in there, and even introduce them in the middle of games for a specific matchup or function. And they're able to get production out of those guys. And everybody didn't have that. Some years you wish you could only bat 7 or 8 guys because you don't have 9, right? And LSU's got, hey, you want to roll out a 13-man lineup? We're here for you. We got the dudes. And I feel like that kind of depth really is an advantage for them compared to most teams that they're going to play. And then on the flip side of that, pitching wise, they've got so much talent. If one guy doesn't bring it or doesn't have it, it's not the end of the world because they do have somebody who can back them up and come in and right the storm, right? So I feel like if you're LSU, you're really happy with where you are. You're going to roll in, into conference play with a gaudy record, and be feeling pretty good about it once you get there. And now you've been tested, so you took some punches, and I feel like that's important for everyone. The other part to keep in mind is, you mentioned the freshman. Curiel has just been amazing. He's not playing like a freshman at all, and then you throw in the returnees, a guy like Josh Pearson. I mean, he gets the game-winning hit on Friday. He has 3 doubles on Saturday, and he's just, and you mentioned, won the MVP of the tournament. He's not someone that you expect to be one of the top hitters. In fact, I mean, he's one of those guys that you kind of recruit over and you bring in somebody to take his job, right? And what ends up happening is you have multiple guys that you can win with at his spot because he's elevated as well. So I'm bullish on LSU. I like where they are at this point, and I'm kind of with you. I feel like those are the 2 best teams in the country at the moment, and with the Balls and the Bayou Bengals.
Yeah, I don't want to totally cast off A&M, obviously, and I'm not saying we're doing that, but right now in this moment, when you take current form into consideration, it does feel like Tennessee and LSU have broken off a little bit right now for me. I mean, 3 weeks in, like, it's way too small a sample, but like, I just kind of came away so impressed with those 2 teams this weekend in a way that A&M just obviously didn't, and we talked about that.
Right.
One other team that really impressed this weekend is Auburn.
Yeah.
And they're a little bit different in terms of, we had them ranked outside the top 25, and I think people understood that. We just kind of it was just a wait and see. You saw them in the fall, liked what you saw. I heard a lot of positive things, but, when you're coming off of the season they had, I think it's understandable that we had an ounce or 2 of skepticism and wanted to see it. And boy, did we ever. 3-0 this weekend, wins over Baylor, Oregon State, and Ohio State. Yeah. That's not in the correct order, but you get it. So, we'll see Baylor and Ohio State, like, we'll see what they end up being, but certainly Oregon State, a really quality team, really, really talented. So an impressive win after Oklahoma had the same win last weekend against Oregon State. Oregon State is kind of a gateway team right now for SEC teams to jump into the rankings discussion. But the thing for me, and then I'll turn it over to you, because I think you've seen Auburn a little bit more and are a little more locked into them at this point of the season. But to me, what stood out is that the lineup is so much better than I assumed it would be. I thought that had a very good chance to be their strong suit, ultimately. Anytime you bring back Ike Irish and Cooper McMurray, and that's your 1-2, I think obviously it's a really good start. But it's, again, they're freshmen, Rimbert and Bub Terrell and Chase Freilich. And then, some of the transfers that I didn't, I thought Eric Snow was a nice player from South Florida, but he's been a fabulous setter. Yeah. And then you tell me that Bristol Carter's hitting under 200. Like, he's not going to be hitting under 200 all year, I wouldn't think. So they stand to get even better once he starts really swinging it well. So I just, I think there's some positives on the mound as well. But, man, that lineup looks so dangerous right now, and they showed it off this weekend.
Yeah. If you would have told me that Cade Fisher would start against Oregon State and wouldn't make it out of the 2nd inning, I would have told you Auburn was in trouble.
They were toast. Yeah.
Yeah. And not only were they not in trouble, they won the game and kind of won it handily. So I feel like Auburn, they had to, one, they needed to get better positionally, and they did. They brought in transfers, and then the freshman row down in that 6 through 8 in the lineup is where they've been hitting. It's just absolutely hitting laser beams everywhere you look. But then on the mound, that was their primary problem last year. They just didn't throw enough strikes, didn't miss enough bats. And this year they're doing both of those things. And the thing I'll point out on them is, one, Fisher didn't give them much, and you expect he will going forward. And also 2 of their most talented arms, Mason Cook and Connor Gatwood haven't pitched yet, and they will before the end of the year as they continue to ramp up from injuries. So they're going to get certainly more talented, with big time stuff, and those are probably going to be bullpen guys that will give you more bullets as you go. Auburn's very impressive so far. They had that one hiccup game where they lost to Holy Cross and have been really good the rest of the way. And they've got they've got Old Dominion coming up, which honestly might be the best series of next weekend. There's just not a lot to pick from, but it's certainly one of them. And that'll be a nice kind of table setting as they head into conference play. Because, Auburn right now is playing – they're playing really well and are put themselves in position, one, to creep into the rankings, but more importantly, two, they look like a team that's with all those new players as they mesh and grow, their best baseball is way ahead of them. So they're a team that should continue to improve as the year goes on.
Sam Dutton was excellent. That to me is he was excellent this weekend. He's been excellent overall. In 16 innings, he's given up 1 earned run. He struck out 23 and walked 4. That'll do it.
Yeah, you'll take that.
Yeah, no kidding. Again, like they maybe do have some, especially if Cade Fisher, like I understand that, he had a lat deal opening weekend, so he got skipped last weekend, and so that's part of why there was the quick hook yesterday. And so maybe there's a little bit of a question mark about where he is. But, even if it's nothing, I do think we could sit here and nitpick, who are your 2 guys behind Dutton right now. But I think that's mitigated by the fact that there have been other pieces who have taken a step forward. I think Cam Tilley's been awesome out of the bullpen. So they've been better, Auburn has, across the board than I thought they would be. But to me, it's to your point, if you'd have told me, I would have, if I'm Auburn, I certainly would have taken the scenario we have, which is the offense is ahead of schedule, and the pitching staff, we're still kind of working through some things, but we've got some guys coming back. Like, I think I would have taken that. So we'll see how it evolves, but certainly, again, a team that I came away extremely impressed with this weekend. And I found myself watching more and more of as the weekend went on, just because I wanted to get a longer look at them.
Yeah, they are. They've been a really pleasant surprise. We talk about A&M on the other side of this has not lived up to expectations. I think Auburn's exceeding them at this point.
Yeah. All right, let's move on to, I'm looking at my rundown sheet and make sure we haven't skipped anybody. Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about some maybe not such a good result from an SEC perspective, and that's South Carolina getting swept by Clemson in that rivalry series. Obviously an important result, but from an SEC perspective, not great. And you and I talked about this before we went on, just about the fact that, for the most part, it's not like Carolina played like, they didn't beat themselves, right? It wasn't just like, oh, they played terrible defense or, whatever. Like, it's just, they just weren't good enough. Like, and that's almost a more frustrating way to summarize it, because it's one thing if it's like, well, we could have maybe competed better if we'd done this thing or that thing. But with Carolina, it's just like, no, there really probably wasn't any scenario that was going to really fundamentally change the results of this weekend. You just got outplayed for 27 innings. Like, that's the long and the short of it. And that's a tough, for a rivalry that runs that hot, that's a tough pill to swallow, that Clemson is just that much better than you are right now.
Yeah. Yeah. It was the difference between an Omaha team and a bubble team. I think that's what we saw. If you want to look for positives, you got 2 really good starts. Saturday and Sunday were great, but when those guys left the mound, the game turned, and that's what's got to be fixed. Also, the offense, which we felt like would be the strength of the team, was just okay. I mean, it wasn't. Clemson's got some good arms, but you know, if you're South Carolina, you've got to do enough, at least in one of those games, to score 7-8 runs, and it never happened. And when you're in a rivalry series like this, you cannot get swept. You've got to find a way, beg, borrow, steal to get one game, and it just didn't happen. So now, if you're South Carolina, you had not played a challenging schedule. You played a really good team 3 times. You learned a lot about yourself. Now you go back and introspect, and you see where you go from here. What do you change? What do you work on? What can you do better? And because there's still, you lose the series, you feel like the season's over, but it's not, right? I mean, there's still a lot to play for. So you just reset, flush it, move on, and you see, because South Carolina, they open up conference play at home against Oklahoma in 2 weeks. That seems like a really interesting series that South Carolina can kind of serve notice. Oklahoma can really pitch it, but can South Carolina match them? Right. And I feel like those are the kind of, you're going to look for series that really stand out as we begin conference play. That one to me stands out. That's one that South Carolina really needs. And of course, you're not there yet. You still got 2 weeks before you get there. But I feel like with what we just saw with the struggles against Clemson, you need something good. You need something to rally around and a proof of concept that, hey, this is going to be a year where we contend. So you got to get there, and all you can do is put your head down and keep grinding, right?
Yeah, that's right. And I'm with you on the positives. I thought Jake McCoy in particular was really sharp. And if you're looking for somebody who could be the Friday guy by the time April rolls around, like he might be who you'll look at, because he, Dylan Eskew's a location guy, experienced. Becker's the same way. Like McCoy's the guy that has stuff.
Can match.
And he's not out there throwing 98, but he's got good enough stuff to go out there and go toe to toe with some of the best in the league. So yeah, I think there's some positive there. I think if you want to squint at the offense and try to find some positive, it's that there are just a handful of guys that we kind of expect to be pretty good contributors that just aren't there yet. I think Henry Kazmar is probably chief among them. He's hitting 171, doesn't have an extra base hit yet. I can't imagine, for a guy who hit over 300 2 years in a row at Ohio State and has some pop and everything else, I have to imagine he'll get going at some point. And Talmadge Lecroy's the other one. He's hitting 115. And, whether or not, whether he's at catcher or whatever else, like he's just going to be in the lineup pretty much every day and is going to have to get going a little bit better. So mostly a tough weekend, but, you can squint and find some positives. And that's what they're going to – South Carolina's going to try to hang its hat on a couple of things. One is that they're maybe they get better, they show improvement, they're a little more competitive come SEC play. And the other, which – I guess if you're a Carolina fan, maybe you don't want to think this way, but honestly, it might make things be a little bit better if it turns out that Clemson's just like a top 10 team, or a top 5 team, and is just going, goes to Omaha. On one hand, that's your rival and you don't want to see that, but on the other hand, it would make this weekend make more sense.
It explains the difference.
Yeah. Right. So it's kind of an interesting spot there if you're a Carolina supporter, that you're kind of rooting for Clemson to be awesome, because at least then it means that, okay, maybe we're not in as bad a place as maybe if you're a fan, you're assuming they are after getting swept. So we'll obviously, time will tell. Speaking of rivalry series, Florida does what it does in their series against Miami and won it again. They took 2 out of 3. Sunday's game got away from them a little bit. They lost that one 13-7. To me, Mark, the results of the games overshadowed a little bit by some of the injury stuff. Florida already mostly without Kyle Jones so far this season. He's played 4 times, including once over the weekend, but he's been obviously not consistently in the lineup. Pierce Coppola had a short start over the weekend. It kind of sounded like it was much ado about nothing, maybe after the game. Kevin O'Sullivan downplayed it, and then Cade Kurland with a separated shoulder. They popped that sucker back in there, but obviously it's not just as easy as it's not like popping an arm back in one of your GI Joes. Like if he's good to go after that, there's a rehab process after that.
Right.
So TBD, I guess, on what we expect from him moving forward. But so a good series win, you'll always take a series win against your rival like that. But some questions did crop up just based around some of the injury stuff we saw over the weekend.
Yeah. I mean, Florida is one of those teams that they've got 12, 13 guys that are quote starters in that lineup, and they just kind of rotate them, and they've had success with it. Sully's pulled those strings. So we talked about the teams that are trying to make those pieces fit together. Well, he's had success with that. Today or Sunday's game was really the first time where the pitching didn't really give them what they needed. The bullpen, it got away from them late. You're also, they've got 2 midweek games coming up this week. You're also trying to keep in mind, okay, what do you do on Sunday to not cost you Tuesday or Wednesday's game as well. So, but Florida's in great shape. I mean, that offense is legit. Brody Donay's hit 6 home runs already this year. He had another one this weekend. It's a deep lineup with a lot of options, and I feel like they're going to be fine. I mean, Liam Peterson, is really good, and when Coppola, assuming, he's back healthy, that gives them a really good 1-2 punch. And then Clemente, he was good until he wasn't today. He was really good, and it just kind of started to wane at the end of his outing, and then the bullpen didn't help him. So it's a talented team. I like where Florida is. I mean, they look like an SEC contender, maybe just a notch below, where you've got Tennessee and LSU up here. I think they're in that next group, with Arkansas and maybe A&M. I'm not sure how to classify them yet, and potentially Georgia there's a group of teams that are all jockeying that seem pretty similar at this point. And I feel like, that's going to be the fascinating part of this, because you're going to go and you're going to have 1 week where you look like the best team in the country, and the next week you're wanting to jump off a bridge because you just lost a big series. And that's the way it's going to be, because the margin for error is so small.
Yeah, I'm with you in the pecking order piece of it. Like, I think Florida is in that kind of range, at maybe a notch below. And yeah, not too worried about the injuries in general, unless Kurland ends up being something more than I think it is. But I think one of the reasons I feel positively about it is, even if Coppola's thing was a real thing, which it doesn't sound like it is, like Aiden King came in after him.
He was really good.
It was great. And it's like, if you needed to start him, like, I would have no qualms if I was Sully in doing that. Like, I think he'd be really good in that role. They've had other bullpen guys that have off to similarly good starts. Luke McNeely is in that group. So yeah, I think they're just fine. Obviously, you'd love to have Kyle Jones. You'd love for Cade Kurland to not have injured his shoulder, but I think they've had enough positives elsewhere that is kind of mitigated some of that, right? I mean, Donay is so much better than he was last year, at least so far, right? The pitching has taken a step forward in a lot of cases. Some of the freshman arms are ready to go. So they're insulated from some of that negative stuff that might have otherwise affected them. Let's talk about Texas, 3-0 in Vegas.
Yeah.
Kind of a weird little tournament out there. In Vegas, you've got one West Coast team, then you had Texas and Illinois, Washington, Texas, Illinois. Who am I missing? Texas Tech. Oh boy, this is not a Big 12 podcast, but holy smokes! I think I mentioned this on Weekend Waypoints at one point this weekend, Mark. Like, Texas Tech has clearly taken a step back, but they looked awful this weekend.
Mm-hmm.
We don't need to expound on that because, again, it's not a Big 12 podcast, but my goodness. That's they got some work to do there. I think for Texas, look, they say you always would prefer to learn about your team in wins versus learning about your team because of losses. And I feel like there's some of that with Texas this weekend where they go 3-0, but I think they've learned that, okay, we need to figure something out as far as a Sunday starter goes. They've tried Cade Bing. It hasn't gone great. He either needs to be better or they need to find someone else for that Sunday spot.
Right.
And then the bullpen still has stuff to work out. They were really in control of that Washington game on Friday, and they just let Washington hang around and hang around and hang around, and then Texas almost messed around and lost that game. And so there's stuff to fix there, and it's weird because last weekend against Dartmouth, the offense went away. And so I don't necessarily know what to make of that. I'm inclined to just look at the Dartmouth weekend as, hey, it was 40 degrees outside and kind of raining.
That's my theory.
Yeah. And so I think what we saw this weekend is certainly it's more like the Texas that I expected to see, but I do think it is more like the Texas that we're going to get, which is that I think the pitching outside of, I think Jared Spencer's good to go. I really like what I've seen from Luke Harrison, but beyond that, I do think there are going to be some white knuckle rides this season for Texas, especially later on in the weekends, and that might just have to be who they are for right now.
Right. It seemed like in the first few weeks that the pitching was the strength and the hitting was was not, and that's the opposite of what we all expected. But I do wonder if it's not weather related. Some of that is just the offense has been down, that played in cold weather conditions, and that once that normalizes, that the offense is actually going to be their strength again. And then the question is, well, is the pitching good enough? And that was the question we had going into it. And certainly, their top 4 or 5 guys, I feel like are solid. But after that, you wonder about the depth pieces, because at times, they have looked good, but other times they haven't. And maybe that's not unique to Texas, but I do feel like that's going to be how far they go will depend on those bullpen pieces, those depth pieces, whether it's midweek starting or third starter, that kind of thing. I feel like that's the biggest questions I have on the Horns right now. But unlike some of the other teams, they're learning these lessons with wins, and I do feel like that's that's obviously the preferred way to do it. And if they're going to roll into SEC play with a really good record, looks like, and because of that, they're going to be in good shape to all their goals will still be in play. And then the whole fascinating part, we've always wondered, well, what would Texas look like, in the SEC? Certainly a great program. It's had a lot of success, and now they're going to have a 10-week gauntlet, like A&M always crowed about. Well, now you get to experience it. So it'll be it's just going to be one of the best storylines of the spring.
Yeah, Texas strikes me as the kind of team, I don't know whether they'll be good enough for this or not. We'll find out. But they strike me as the kind of team that there are going to be weekends and certainly some Sundays along the way where it's going to be kind of ugly, and you're going to go and you're going to doubt it. And I'm going to fall into this, I guarantee you, where you're going to be like, man, is this team any good? Like, what am I looking at here? That this game, this was ugly. This was an ugly weekend. But because they've done so much learning through wins, like in a weekend like this, that it's a team you look up at the end of the year, and they're 16-14 in the SEC. And when you and Aaron and Kendall are putting the field of 64 together, are looking at, I guess Texas is going to host, like they feel like that kind of team where it's like all year, it's just like, it feels like they've never really put it all together or whatever. But then when you look at the full resume, because they've just won ugly a bunch of times, you look up and you're like, yeah, okay, I guess they are going to host, right? And again, maybe they won't be good enough for that, but that's what it feels like a little bit to me. Just a team that's somewhere between 15 and 22 in the country, and they'll have higher highs than that. They'll probably have some lower lows than that. But anytime you can go 3-0 in a tournament and feel like you may not have actually played your best, you'll take it. Because relatedly, Vanderbilt 1-2 out in Southern California, got a nice win to start the weekend against UCLA, and I kind of thought, okay, they scored 8 runs. JD Thompson was good, and you're like, that's how you draw it up. That's what you're looking for. And then the next 2 days just were a different deal.
They didn't hit. Yeah.
They didn't hit, and Ethan McIlvaine struggled again. And to me, that's the two big questions. One is the eternal offense question about Vanderbilt, and the other is, Ethan McIlvaine through 3 starts has an 11.25 ERA. He's striking out a bunch of dudes, but opponents are also hitting 364 against him. Can you do that for another week? I mean, maybe you can, because you've got another non-conference week. You might be able to survive it. But how much more rope do you want to give somebody who's obviously extremely talented, but it feels like based on 3 weeks' performance, it might be a hard sell to go into an SEC weekend with him in the rotation. So between that and the offense, those were kind of the concerns I'm looking at coming out of the weekend for the Commodores.
Well, I mean, if you're a Vandy supporter, would you rather stay at home and beat a MAC team and rule them, or would you rather go out and challenge yourselves against some of the teams Vandy has played, and even if you lose some of those games? I mean, what's the preferred method? Right? Do you want to be 12-1, but we don't really know how good you are? Or would you rather have dropped a few more games and learned, hey, this is not going to work against better competition? And that's the eternal question, right? Because there's a downside to losing games, because it certainly hurts your confidence and it hurts your brand and your mojo and all of these kinds of things. But I don't know if you're just beating people that you're just so much better than, how much that helps you either. So I think that's, if I'm Vandy, that's kind of the balance I'm trying to establish here, because losing to USC and UConn, those are 2 pretty good clubs, and those are the kind of clubs that you're going to face in 2 weeks. So you hope that you learn from that, and you can take those lessons that make you better prepared when I think they open at Auburn, when they go to Auburn, because Auburn's good. So Vandy will have seen somebody, an Auburn-like team, and hopefully they'll be, for their sake, that hopefully they'll be better prepared having faced this challenging schedule, because there's so many different ways that you can approach this, and Corb's taking 2 tournament trips versus staying at home, and because the majority of the conference stays at home for all but one weekend, right? And he's taken 2, and against good competition. So yeah, I think for me, that's what makes Vanderbilt maybe a little tougher evaluation compared to some of the other teams in the conference.
Interestingly, so I looked ahead. I'd kind of forgotten about this. They've got Xavier next weekend, and that's a team they're more talented than. That's a team they should win that series, but Xavier's beaten Indiana twice this year. Mm-hmm. They beat Liberty in a series on the road, and they split 4 with Stanford. Yeah. And so, Vanderbilt might go and sweep that series, and it's not going to be a shock, and we'll just move on with our lives. But I do think there's a distinct possibility it's not going to be a super fun time. Mm-hmm. Xavier is old. Xavier is just, they're not sexy, but they're old and pretty talented, and they've got some real arms, and
battle tested.
They play a good schedule every year. Like, this from doing Nerdcast, they're always like 500 in the Big East, but have an RPI of 38. Right. And you're just like, what do we do with this team? So I kind of looking at that series and wondering, like, I'll put it this way: almost regardless of how it looks, if Vanderbilt sweeps that series at home this coming weekend, like you're just going to take that and be thrilled about it, because Xavier is the type of team that'll ruin your weekend if you let them. Like, that's to me, that's the long and the short of it. All right. We're going to breeze through the rest of it here. We're going to do just like we did last weekend. And again, our apologies that we can't get to talking about everyone at depth, because there are some other results that probably deserve a little more than we're able to give them here. But I'm going to lay out some of the results here, and then Mark, feel free to pick out one or a couple or whatever you want to do to tease out here for our last few minutes. Kentucky swept Hofstra over the weekend. The opponent, not that impressive. However, the way they did it, particularly Ben Cleaver on the mound in the middle game of the series, super impressive stuff there. Georgia swept Florida Gulf Coast. And Mark, I have never seen a team come so close to winning a series and end up getting swept as Florida Gulf Coast did this afternoon. Like, 3 of those 4 games, you could argue they should have won. And they lost them all. Just brutal. Them and Ohio State this season are 2 teams that just can't seem to buy a win that they should have. Poor Ohio State's now 1-8, and they've been in every single game this season except for one. But I digress. So Georgia gets that done. Arkansas sweeps Charlotte. Had to work pretty hard for that one too. I said on Waypoints this weekend that I think that maybe just says that Charlotte's probably better than I'm giving them credit for. Gackle really struggled on Friday, though. Something to watch. I'm kind of interested to see his start next week, to see what the deal is there, if that was just a total blip on the radar or if maybe there's something else going on there. But they did get the sweep of Charlotte. Missouri splits with Evansville. On paper, you're like, well, okay, but this is not that Evansville. They graduated a lot of talent. It's not a great result for Mizzou, but they split 4. Oklahoma sweeps CSUN, Cal State Northridge. Oklahoma rolls on. They keep on doing it. Bama sweeps North Dakota State. NDSU they were kind of game for it. Like, they actually played pretty well, I felt like, but Bama takes care of business. And then Ole Miss sweeps Wright State. Mark, of those results, what stands out to you?
Well, I think I'll start with Georgia, just how they were never out of a game. I mean, they came back they got off to some horrid starts, and they continue to, some days their pitching is incredible, and others, I mean, they're getting lit up right away and having to claw out of these big holes, and they were able to do so. I mean, I think today it was 3-0 in the 8th. They scored 2 in the 8th, and then 2 more to walk it off in the 9th. And to be able to do that, one, it gives you a lot of confidence. Hey, we're never out of a game. If you get behind against somebody, you'll be able to do it. But the other part of that is eventually you're going to get behind somebody who you're not going to be able to do that against. So it's kind of a double-edged sword there. And then Arkansas, a similar deal, huge deficit, then able to come back. And those games were close as well with Charlotte all weekend. It's, part of me enjoys, hey, you've been tested, you've been in a fight, you understand how to get back up when you get knocked down. The other part of this is, why are you struggling so much? That would be the other part of this. So, if you're a top 5 team in the country, you probably should have a little easier time, but they didn't. So those stood out. I think the other thing is with Alabama, Justin LeBron, he now has 8 home runs. He had a grand slam on Sunday. He's just, you look at him, he is not your prototypical big slugger looking guy. He's kind of lean and wiry, but boy, that ball jumps off his bat, and he's having a tremendous start to the season. The competition hasn't been super imposing, although, Jacksonville was pretty good last week. But I feel like that's a team that I'm unsure about as when the competition increases in a couple of weeks. What are they? Are because they look like they're going to be able to hit, and if that continues, they're going to be a hard team to deal with.
I'm with you on a lot of that stuff. I think the Georgia piece is most fascinating to me, because we're now seeing the value of having that pitching depth, because they in those situations, they can just cycle through guys until they find somebody who's on his game.
Yeah.
But right now, at least from a rotation standpoint, I mean, they're looking at, Colton Smith is still working back from, getting scratched opening weekend, and they're still working him back. Charlie Goldstein is still getting stretched out. He's only thrown 4 innings this year, and he's yet to give up a hit, so it's going pretty well, but they're still stretching him out. But then beyond that, you've got JT Quinn, and, you just wonder how much trust he would have given the way, the last couple of seasons at Ole Miss went. Leighton Finley's ERA is almost 5. Zach Harris's is over 6. Brian Zeldin's is over 7. Like, those are the guys they've been starting. And so they've needed the depth, and Lord knows they have it, but it's just been pressed a little more than I thought it would be, so something to monitor, because they got options, and they've absolutely needed them. All right, Mark, that is it for what I imagine will be, at least until we get into the teeth of SEC play, will be probably our most jam-packed episode. Just a lot of stuff to get to. And also, life gets easier when these teams start playing each other.
Right.
And so
8 games instead of 16. Yeah.
Right, exactly. So, all right, that is going to do it for this edition of the Highway to Hoover podcast, a production of SEC Extra over at d1baseball.com. Want to thank our sponsors, Academy Sports and Outdoors and Tecovas Boots, for being with us on Highway to Hoover this season. Happy to have them on board. Thank you again to Mark for joining me, as always, and thank you, the listeners, for listening.